Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome again to SAM Chats. This is a series of conversations where I speak to leading curators, museum directors, and other cultural leaders. And today we'll have Zoe Butt with us. Welcome, Zoe, and thank you for joining us this morning. Well, before we begin the session, I just want to go through some quick housekeeping matters. Please do note that this session will be recorded today. We'll also be taking questions from all of you at the end of the session. The microphones will be muted for audience members, but you can submit your questions by clicking on the little arrow on the top right of your screen to extend the function, and then you'll see the questions button. And if you are viewing this on a mobile device, the questions function can be found just below this video. Okay, so let me introduce our speaker for today. Zoe Butt is the Artistic Director of the Factory Contemporary Art Center in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And prior to this, Zoe served as an Executive Director and Curator of Sàn Art, the Director of International Programs at the Long March Project, and also as Assistant Curator for Contemporary Asian Art at the Queensland Art Gallery. Well, her curatorial practice centers on building critically thinking and historically conscious artistic communities, fostering dialogue among countries of the Global South. Well, amongst the numerous exhibitions she has curated, Zoe was also one of the curators for the Sharjah Biennale last year in 2019. And she's also involved with various international initiatives, such as being a member of the Asian Art Council of the Guggenheim Museum in New York, Asia 21 Leaders of the Asia Society in New York, and in 2015 became a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, which I'm keen to find out more about. Welcome again, and thank you for joining us, Zoe. So let me begin. I want to begin by asking you about the role of art. So you've been involved with the Vietnamese art scene for a while now, with Sàn Art and then now with the Factory. And we know that in Vietnam's art history, ideology had a very strong link to art at certain points in its history, especially during the period between reunification and Doi Moi in 1986, through social realism. Of course, there were also other art forms being made by artists. Now, what role do you think art and culture plays in Vietnamese society today? And do you think there's been a change in this understanding of art's role?
Thank you, Eugene. Thanks to Sam for the invitation and to all of you out there who are listening in. Culture in Vietnam has a very long and respected position as a form of tradition. I would say that in Vietnam, heritage is the most understood form of culture for the mass publics. And that heritage is largely coming in through religion, but it's also coming through its historical architectures. For the fine arts, I would say that really in Vietnam, we're still facing quite a lot of confusion as to how to define it today. And when I say confusion, that is largely a result of an education system that still does not teach contemporary art. Sadly, we don't have any museums that also really engage and critique and curate and purchase contemporary art. Our educational systems are really so much in need of some innovation, some more collaboration to be able to get differing ideas of what art and culture can mean today for Vietnam. That being said, there is a phenomenal resilience on the part of the artistic community across the country that I have always been in awe of and still remain indebted with great respect for the conditions that they've had to face with the shifts from colonialism to the imprimatur of a heavy ideology, to then this introduction of a capitalistic approach to culture, which is largely embraced by tourism, where we see artists graduate and they think that the dollar value of their work is how we create meaning. And it is largely that conundrum of what is the meaning of art that has committed me to Vietnam, and indeed is a daily mantra for me in a more global context, to ask ourselves of the localities of meaning when it comes to thinking about contemporary art. In Vietnam today, we're still struggling to build a local collector base for contemporary art. And when it comes to differentiating the modern from the contemporary, we also still have quite a heavy confusion as to why there is that differentiation.
But while we know around the world, but also particularly in Southeast Asia, the art market in the last 5-10 years has really exploded. And I think the Vietnamese art market has also, in a sense, been affected by this, particularly with the modernist artists. Have you seen any changes to the scene because of this? Because of this commodification of art itself?
The work produced by artists prior to 75 is really very little seen, exposed, discussed within the country. A lot of that material, sadly, is no longer here, living in foreign collections and
some of
private
them
and
are
public.
in Singapore, I think.
Yes, some good works in Singapore. For the work, the collective bases that are still based in Vietnam and have an interest in this material, I know, because I have spoken to several auction houses, that Vietnamese modern art are guaranteed lots of sale because the number of people actually within Vietnam purchasing is the highest. So I think that's an interesting trend or phenomenon. What I'm curious is how to get those people still wanting to acquire modern art to also understand the synergy of that material to contemporary practice of living artists today. I do see a slow conversation shifting just by networks on the ground here in Vietnam becoming more interconnected, particularly in Saigon. Yeah.
And around the world, we've seen quite a few artists from Vietnam making a mark for themselves in international exhibitions. Biennales, Curator, the Propeller Group, Art Labor. To what extent do these kinds of international networks and influences have they helped kind of the perception and the development of contemporary forms of art?
I think the international collaboration is incredibly important for any artist, wherever they are in the world. For the context of Vietnam, it is the ability to participate in foreign projects that gives hope. Because we do suffer, sadly, quite a lack of exposure here in Vietnam to what the meaning of art can be today, it means that many artists look afar for opportunity rather than within their local. And that to me is always quite sad. And that's another reason why I commit to being at the factory. I always encourage learning. I think that the study of art and culture is actually something that we do as a life project. It's not something you just go to university and you've graduated and you've completed, which a lot of artists still do think that in Vietnam. I like to think that learning is constant, and that means participation. And so being able to get opportunities to show and to challenge your perspectives is incredibly important. So when we think about art labor, when we think about artists like Thao Nguyen Phan or Tuan Andrew Nguyen, and then you think about their practices and what they're saying. And I think that's where it's becoming, at least, I think, quite particular as a characteristic perhaps of what's getting taken up by international of Vietnam contemporary today, is that the subject matter of these artists is incredibly compelling in that they're setting up narratives that look at Vietnam from today to histories that are little known, to archival material that is little known, to folk traditions, to ideas of culture that challenge the stereotypes of what Vietnamese culture or as a nation represents. And I think that that's where the tussle between participating abroad and being local is very healthy.
And are these artists still having trouble kind of operating and making their work in Vietnam?
Making art in Vietnam is a gift. To be an artist here, the access to materials, to the tools, at least physically, is phenomenal. When it does come to accessing historical material because of our cultural system being somewhat labored under the histories of colonialism. Much of what they need access to is abroad. So it does come down to how much money they have to be able to access foreign archives, what kinds of permissions they can access and have lobby for their right to view. When it comes to filmmaking in Vietnam, it is tough. You have to get permissions to be able to go into communities to take footage. But I do think that actually permissions are necessary for wherever you are, whether it's official or unofficial. So I think that many artists here have it pretty good.
What about when it comes to exhibiting their works within Vietnam?
That's a different issue. Exhibiting is a little more tricky. We do, as an institution, at least for the factory, any activity, whether it's an exhibition or a public program, we are expected to seek official approval from the Ministry of Culture. And under that guidance, we can or cannot say, do certain things, which we respect. Because the factory, at least in this instance, is committed to regular programming for a general public in the interest of increasing the awareness of what art and artists can operate and think and be conceived of in society. So it is important to us that we keep going. But the ways around that is to ensure that private viewings of the work are made possible, to select audiences who are committed, who really seek to understand and want to participate. So for us, there's a two-tier constant level of programming that is invisible and visible.
That's interesting. Well, I mentioned earlier that you were one of the curators of the Sharjah Biennale last year, which was titled Leaving the Echo Chamber. Around the world and in many societies, you've seen the world becoming increasingly polarized. Right? The dialogue has really broken down, and rhetoric and polemic has really taken over. Now we see this manifested in things like cancel culture, for example, and the increasing tensions between different segments of society. What role do you think art and museums can play at this time? Well, the art world is, of course, also seen as part of one of these camps. Do you think, as Chantal Mouffe has argued, that the agonistic society, where these differences in our society are here to stay and something we have to accept and find ways to deal with? Or can art do something about this?
I think art and culture can do a hell of a lot. And it is really up to the leaders of the institutions, the producers inside these institutions, to rethink their capacity, their agency. I really do firmly believe that. COVID-19 has really hit at a certain moment of the Earth's balance, so to speak, and its ensuing impact has revealed quite a lot of social injustice. You know, we have the revealing of opaque governance. We have the issue of human to non-human relationships, if we think about the virus having initiated in exotic animals that we think we need to consume. The impact of the virus and the lack of human mobility, and the fact that this has meant our climate, our natural resources have replenished somewhat. The air in Saigon is phenomenal. When we think about the impact of fear on our ability to engage another, the social distancing measures, and what impact our ability to heal and assist the ill, when we realize that race concerns factor into this. I mean, all of this reveals a sense of interdependence that I think we need to have more awareness of in our cultural programming. I really think that we need to conceive not only our programs as addressing all of those issues, but also the makeup of our. We need to think about where our speakers of cultures are coming from. What experience do they have to be able to speak of that culture? And if you don't have it present in the makeup of where you are, invite it in. And now, because of COVID, we have a more pliable public who are actually, and also participants, who are aware doing things online is not impossible. Before, there was a reticence. There was a feeling that, oh, doing online, it could be too terribly complicated. But this COVID-19 virus has prompted all of us to learn sets of digital tools. So now the ability to engage is actually collapsing somewhat. Of course, don't get me wrong, I will always err on the need to have physical contact with people and ideas. I much prefer a cup of coffee with a group of people to bat out an idea than a Zoom chat or a live storm moment. But I think that museums really, as the producers inside it, we need to start thinking about how can we be more inclusive of our conversations in our heads, and how can we stir our processes, our methodologies, so that A, we're not so dependent on things that we think we need financially, and to rethink how knowledge is something that actually sits beyond what is financially valued. I really feel an urgent need to focus on education, on the knowledge basis of how we act, to think about the endemic systems of hierarchy and status and access that we may not actually understand, that we've been subliminally trained to operate in.
No, as you rightly said, I think this whole pandemic has brought us to really rethink a lot of the foundations of how we've operated, and also revealing a lot of the crises that are existing in our world, which such as a climate crisis, for example, which you cannot divorce from this current pandemic, as well as inequalities that are inherent in our societies. Right? But it's also led to, yes, I think institutions rethinking what their roles and missions are. And staying with the topic of biennales, somehow there seems to be thinking that it can still continue the way it was. All the biennales that were disrupted this year are being moved next year. And last count, there are going to be about 20 biennales happening next year, for example. Right? And I don't know, even before this pandemic, there was a kind of question as to whether biennales are still relevant in our world. And there's been a review of whether they're still needed. So how do you think biennales will survive this crisis? Do you think they're still relevant, especially in light of what's happening?
I think biennales are still relevant, yes. But I do ask myself, do we need so many, and do they need to occur so frequently? I understand that certain localities, very much in the global south, for example, don't have arts infrastructure like they do upstairs. And so the chance to participate and expose practice within these frameworks as a biennale or a triennale are very important. And they do stir questions for a local in a way that sometimes the local organizations just important in that way. But I do get very concerned about the definitions of spectacle coming in that define spectacle by scale, and a certain investment of production that steers practice towards needing large budgets to be able to say what they need to say. I think we need
biennales, because that's the reason why governments, local authorities would invest in biennales, precisely for that kind of a spectacle.
Yes, correct. And while spectacle does, it does make our general public who know very little about art stand up and notice. And those spectacle moments do draw new publics in. I understand that. But I think we need to balance. We need to really canvas the need for quantity. With the Biennale model as it stands right now, the ability to ship is going to be drastically affected, I think, by COVID-19. Budgets have been slashed. So the ability to ship is a major issue. And so what does that spell for an artist? Like, to produce work in Southeast Asia, for example, is much cheaper than Europe. So does that mean that artists in this part of the world are going to have to produce everything in Europe? I mean, the scale of that financially is also ridiculous. So what we, I think, are facing is we need to recalibrate how the model of biennales are set up. I think what we actually need is more collaboration. Biennales need to now work not only with funding bodies, but we need to share the display costs or the production costs with local organizations so that work starts to actually travel and be of use as a speaking and a discursive point for more than just one locale. I think that is one option which takes much more negotiative work on the part of an organizer, which is why I err on the side of giving more time to the production of these exhibitions so that the work, especially commissions, they're not only seen far away, but they're able to come back and have a presence in the local where the artist lives and works. I think we need to start thinking like that, longer term benefit. At least that's what I'd like to see.
So I know these restrictions that you just talked about it's also something that many museums have to start thinking about, restrictions in terms of travel for artworks, thinking how museums then need to kind of focus more on local publics, regional publics, regional collections and exhibitions. How do you think this crisis is going to affect how museums operate going forward?
What I'm scared of is that museums become insular and only nation focused because of the financial limits. I really do hope that leaders of these institutions understand that they have to keep acknowledging the need for difference, to understand the way we think is different to understanding another, and we need that dialogue in our everyday. So that's one nervousness I have. I think, I hope also that we, with this sudden realization we can't bring in blockbuster shows perhaps from Europe, that we start thinking about different kinds of blockbusters from the region. Different museums exist in our local imagination, historical imagination. And so we need to actually unpack that. There's a lot of material in our midst that is fascinating and deserves more attention. But I do understand that we still struggle with many publics who want that blockbuster Western moment. So I do think it comes from educational programming within institutions. And for that, I am very sad to see the layoffs in the US when it comes to most educational staff being the first to let go. I do think that it is with and through education that our publics can understand the relevance of material, of storytelling, of different understandings of history and cultural practice, and it comes through those programs. So I think we have to get more inventive with our local neighborhood, and that local is not something that I read as nation-bound. That local is about how, for example, Vietnam's lower regions were once a part of the Cham Empire. We need to understand those histories and synergies more than just the present moment of geopolitics that says Vietnam's borders are here. So that's what I'm hoping we can see more discussion of as a consequence of these financial and travel limits.
Yes, now the layoffs and the disruptions to museums, the cancelling of these large exhibitions also reveals the kind of underlying neoliberal capitalist system that most institutions are kind of founded on and how they operate. So it'd be interesting to see how we then cope with rethinking the museum in still within this kind of a context, albeit maybe slightly changed.
Yeah.
Well, Vietnam has seemed to have coped really well with the pandemic. I think it's had 1 or 2 deaths, I think, in the whole country, or still zero. Okay, now I understand the country is more or less fully open. It'll be open internationally in a few weeks' time. So do you think all this will be a distant memory for a lot of the people and the artists who are just, dying to kind of get life back to normal again after this period of lockdown? How do you think this will impact their work, their artistic practice? And have they been impacted in a serious way, I suppose?
Yes, it has gone back to a normality. No social distancing, domestic flights are full, tourism has never been at such a domestic high ever before, no deaths. I personally feel very lucky to have been in Vietnam during this particular crisis. When it comes to the artists, I do know of many whose production of various works has been hindered. Also filmmakers. I mean, it's been quite impossible to film. Social distancing, incredibly difficult, you can imagine. So when it comes to, do I fear that everything just gets slightly forgotten? I fear that greatly. I wonder if that so-called predicted second wave will actually hit, and to what extent does my team need to put its own precautions and systems in place so that we are not just victims. Like, how are we going to put up precautionary measures? But I think that when it comes to programming and thinking about the role of our institution and how we as a staff survive the fact that we've had salary cuts, our program money has been cut, our operation hours, our working hours have also been cut. You know, I've been quite concerned about what that means for commitment when you've had so much cut. So as the director of the factory, I've really made an effort to sit down with my team, particularly my curators, and to ensure that we have monthly reading group just between us, so that our interests can maintain rigor and that nothing, we don't want to just get dropped into this factory. I really, as a consequence of this virus, I don't want to return to this forever factory line of just action. I really want some time to think, and that was one thing I really appreciated from the irony of the lockdown, was that the ability to teach myself, to give time to thinking, and I want that as a part of being inside the museum system for me here, but also for when I do things abroad. But I think for the practice of artists, I think artists in light of this whole crisis have probably been, and I don't want to set generalizations, but I think many artists live in their studios and are very happy to let the world out. I know of many artists who have actually been quite somewhat bizarrely grateful for the fact that they can have time to just make. But I do understand that many exhibitions have been cancelled. Many opportunities of earning livelihood has been, and that is of great concern globally. I think in Vietnam, because we don't have such an active market, the resilience and the ability to sort solutions is of more an everyday kind of mantra. But I do understand that on a global scale, our artists are in need of our support.
Yes, I think another discussion I had, this issue of how an artist defines themselves and their labor, and how an artist, in a sense, is identified with the work that they produce. Of course, this comes from being part of this system that we operate in, and whether artists can still be artists and be identified as artists if they're not exhibiting their work, producing work. So it's a very interesting questions, I think, in our day and age as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things that I've been quite obsessed with in Vietnam for the past few years is the role of artists as educators. Trying to increase the awareness that artists don't only make discrete objects, but they are also in the process of making their work learning, and that process is a collaborative process that we all can learn something from. And in addition to that, that many artists are actually brilliant teachers. They may not participate in the formal system of education, but they have so much in terms of their research and approach and methodology, not only to art, but society at large. Differing perspectives and relationships to engineering, to cosmologies, to politics, to ideas of social welfare. I mean, I've learned so much from artists, and I really would like to see more acknowledgement for what they can. And also about artists understanding this too. Many artists just don't want to own the fact that they're that good, but I think they are.
So you talked about some of the changes you've had to make at the factory. Can you tell us what are the upcoming plans for the factory and what changes you've had to make or so?
Our whole program has had to be delayed by roughly 2 months. Everything shifted. We are right now in the process of installing 3 shows that are opening on the 19th of June. We have had shipments affected. This next show has come in from a Vietnamese American artist, and her work has had some production issue in the US. So we've had to think of alternative solutions until the work can arrive. Prior to COVID, we were already mapping out a series of collaborative relationships with various educational institutions. And I was concerned because of the school terms being shifted that we would all be in this endless delay. But it's really brilliant that, for example, Fulbright University is working with us on a project called Realigning the Cosmos, looking at the role of the 5 elements in relationship to spiritual belief and how we consume certain earth resources, overly consuming them at an exploitative rate, and what does that mean for our beliefs. So Fulbright University has been brilliant in saying, let's do this, we can do it online, we can get the students involved now regardless. But in terms of our overall programs, though we have had budget cuts, it hasn't directly impacted that we have to delete. What we're doing is reconceiving the shape of everything so that we can afford to still do it. My team and I are very committed to the ideas behind what we're doing, more so than the need for the visual, where we're really still, though we will still have the visual, but we are very determined that we will still, because we do a lot of artistic development, as in we do research with artists. That is a big part of our program. So luckily, none of that has been.
Well,
we do have international projects rolling. One called Pollination, which is taking place between Thailand and Indonesia. That has had heavy impact. The fellowship between Leah and Kitima has somewhat delayed, take place online. But I've really been so happy with the way that everyone's just coming on board, just adapting to the context and saying, we still wanted to do this. So there's been a lot of online work, but all positive.
Yeah, so the questions have been coming in thick and fast, so maybe we should allow them to be heard and for you to answer them. The first one, since we're talking about online exhibitions, from Wong Li Fang, how is curating an exhibition online different from a real world one?
Oh, incredibly different.
Have you done an exhibition online?
Yes, I have done online exhibitions. I did one called Embedded Souths in 2015, which was a film-based festival actually taking place across roughly 15 different sites across the global south. But that was very much about targeting the access that online technologies can give. I think when you're confronted with trying to translate a physical exhibition into something that is conceived online, it's very different because the spatial experiences of an object are very different to an online mode. If you do a 3D video of an exhibition, if you do not have that exhibition up, then you're only relying on the digital imaging tool to give you the emotive feedback, which I think is dangerous. I don't think technology can give that emotive feedback. If you have an actual exhibition installed and you're documenting it and putting it online as an exhibition, that is, I think, is a little easier. But nothing can ever take away from the physical experience of an artwork. That being said, doing things online, nowadays we can insert video excerpts wherever we want. If you have the right technology, you can create feedback tools. So I'm not denying the fact that online can have its additional benefits, but I will always err on the necessity for the real world ones because, I mean, for example, right now I'm in front of you, you're only seeing my top half, you can't see my bottom half. My body language is read through a prism of a small little space. And I never want to think that an artwork is going to be read similarly. So for me, online exhibitions will only ever be, unless it's for the digital medium itself. Other than that, I can't come and fathom the idea of curating something like that.
So do you think the online platform is something that will always be supplementary or complementary to the actual physical experience of the museum or the art space, that it can never be something, an alternative in a different way? No?
I think the online world is brilliant in giving access. I do believe that, you know, for the realization of any creative project, the added tools that online data can bring to increase the knowledge and awareness, that is incredibly important and representative of the era we live, and we should all better learn how to use those tools. However, context and site specificity when it comes to artistic production and facilitation should never be underestimated. Our knowledges are local, our languages are local, and they're local because of a relationship that is physical to site and time and space. And that needs to be better respected in our world.
But that raises another interesting question, because a large majority of our world, especially the younger generation, I would say, experiences much of the world through the smartphones or how do you then get them to understand that it's actually the physical experience that is key, and not this mediated experience that they have? And
well, you know, the factory's Facebook page is, you know, incredibly, I'm always aghast at how many people actually log on, and I'm totally aware that educating through that network is not to be underestimated. I think it's about how we communicate online. To what extent do we use our words online to say, this is an idea that comes from, but experienced in real time is. I think it's making the way we promote things clear, to understand you are only experiencing perhaps 1/10 of what the experience can be in its physicality. And we need to better express that when we communicate and use social medias.
Okay, thank you. A question here from Lily Chung about the market. So, hi Zoe, what is it that the Vietnamese diaspora are not collecting as much or as aggressively as Chinese or Indian diaspora, which really fuel the Chinese and Indian art markets?
I think this is about history. This is about Vietnamese history. The Vietnam War is only relatively recent when we really sit down and think about it. And the ability for the Vietnamese diaspora to, first of all, move beyond the fact that Vietnam is no longer a communist prism of violence and brutality like it was during the war. Much of the Vietnamese diaspora still, sadly, I'm not saying all communities, but many of them do feel that there is an ideological barrier as to why they perhaps should support, perhaps. On the other end, I would say is, unlike Singapore, for example, where you have the Singapore Art Museum and there's a lovely website and there's social media access, or the National Gallery of Singapore, in Vietnam, it's very hard to gain access to information. If you want to buy, where do you go? Who do you ask? The benchmarks of what quality or of insight for Vietnamese contemporary art is quite thin. It's difficult to access. I think, you know, if you want to buy a house, you do a tremendous amount of research. You understand value by going to certain dealers or markets. For Vietnamese art, we still need a lot more work there. We need more discourse.
Okay, we have 3 questions from Chisai Fujita. Maybe I'll start with the first one. So first question is, what is national identity? In Denmark, not Copenhagen, I met Vietnamese artists whose family was escaped in Vietnam War by boat. I think we can guess it's someone we know.
Yeah.
Vietnamese are less in the population than Chinese. We can't meet them now, and we don't know its history now. Sorry, yes,
Uh,
national identity.
yeah, I struggle with this question. I have to say, I think that what I would like to see is contemporary art moving away from the discussion or need of a national identity. I was recently asked by a Vietnamese journalist to describe the character of Vietnamese contemporary art. And I was very open with her and saying, I'm really struggling with this. I'm quite tired of being asked of this, because are we ready to accept that, for example, a Vietnamese person who's born in Vietnam, who grows up in, say, Copenhagen, and then spends his life in Europe, but then by the media gets claimed to be Vietnamese and yet has spent most of his life outside of Vietnam. To what extent do we get obsessed with that conversation rather than look at the work itself? I think we need to move away from the need for an identity of the artist according to nation, and instead look at the artwork being proposed and understand the stories inside that as representative of the times in which we are living. Like, for example, I'm a Hong Kong Australian who has not been in Australia for over 20 years, who's lived between China and Vietnam and done many international projects. From which point am I allowed to speak as an Australian? From which point am I allowed to say that my experience in Vietnam counts for something and so therefore I can comment? What I want to see is more engagement of what we are making, what we are doing, instead of an obsession of this is me, I am, without looking at what we do. That's the only way I know how to answer that question, sorry.
A very good answer, I think. The question here from Sarah Liv. How do you see the difference in making art and institutions between Saigon and Hanoi?
When I first came to Vietnam, which was 2007, most of the contemporary art production was in Hanoi, and that was because it had the highest number of artist-run activities, spaces to show contemporary art by Vietnamese artists. And that has dramatically shifted in the last 5 to 7 years. Now we see a complete flip where more institutions and artist-run organizations are anchored in Saigon. The difference in making art.
What has accounted for this change from Hanoi to Saigon?
There are many different ways of looking at this. Personally, I feel it's the return of the overseas Vietnamese, the Viet Kieu, who were majoritively historically from the South. So we see many artists who have studied abroad returning, and they bring certain energies and certain perspectives to the role of art, the circulation of art, the meaning of art, and it's meant that there's more activity. And I was lucky to sort of witness at the time when the term is Viet Kieu, where we see the Viet Kieu and the local community in the very early days very isolated and not really talking to one another, very suspicious, particularly from the local towards the Viet Kieu. But now we see much more interaction, friendships, collaborations, and I think it's really just about where our families are anchored that has caused a lot of that to come south. That being said, in the last 2 years, what we're witnessing is an even more shift where we see Hanoian artists and curators coming to Saigon. We see Saigonese artists going to Dalat, to Da Nang, to Hue. So there's this shift actually happening in the country for where artists are choosing to make and to live. And really, that's an economical choice.
Okay,
and the difference in art. I didn't really answer that question, but I'm not quite sure what you mean there. But access to production across the country, we have artists from the South working in the North. We have artists from the North working in the South, the Center. Most artists in Vietnam are actually choosing to work all over the country, wherever their interests take them.
Okay, maybe the second question from Chisai Fujita. What is space and exhibition? Because of the current restrictions where people can't travel to see exhibitions, do you think there's a need to think about a new way to think about space and exhibitions?
I think that at least my last experience of the lockdown, I was just telling Eugene before, I have been attending so many online moments with artists, curators, academics, and the space of meeting online, I've learned so much. So in light of COVID-19, what is apparent to me is that the pace of learning for me over the last 6 weeks, particularly, or 2 months, has been tremendous. So when we think about space and exhibition, I guess what I am erring, but this was something shifting in me before COVID. It's been something with me as a curator for a long time. It fed into the ideas of Sharjah Biennial, is that an exhibition isn't always about presenting a visual moment. That an exhibition can be a discursive set of questions that you're unpacking artistically, where small moments or performances or music pieces or scientific collaborations enter the equation, and they are visual, they are performative, they are interactive, but the actual idea of the single space presenting a finality, I personally have always struggled with that. And I think that comes about as a consequence of having been in a country like Vietnam, where raising exhibitions is so difficult. So I've had to come at other solutions to work with artists so that we are both mutually still learning. So I think in terms of COVID-19, definitely on the part of the audiences, we have to be more tolerant. We have to understand that what we're experiencing online is not the only experience of what we're being creatively fed. There needs to be more generosity, because when you've got only a digital interface, it's very different.
We have a question from Dee Chia, who is our head of education and programs here at SAM. You mentioned earlier that you fear that museums become insular. Will you be able to share your views on some key features of museum educational programs which are successful in making visible what is less evident in society? Perhaps to bring communities together and in challenging, responding, and celebrating the realities which surround museums.
The work that I did with the Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art really taught me a lot. I don't know if you're familiar, but the program of education was what taught me that artists are educators in themselves. So for a great part of that project, you'll have an artist contributor work of art that's commissioned for the actual show.
Yeah,
but then there are, but it's not only for kids. It's not only for the kids. There are moments for adults where artists are a part of the educational process of conceiving programming. So their research identifies certain communities that need to be given voice and brought in to the institution to share their stories. And I think when it comes to making sure that you are opening up the doors is by understanding the artists you're working with in terms of the process, understanding the communities of care that matter to them, tapping into where those communities are, and trying to ensure that those people are not only present as a part of the programming you deliver to your public, but also your team, your staffing, because that will impact the way you interpret the art. And it's the way, if you're purchasing works of art, it will also impact the way that those collections are archived. So for me, it's about researching artistic practice. It's about really understanding who were these works talking to at the time of production, the time of their display, if you're buying historical works. And I've always, and still do this at the factory, we all believe here the need for interdisciplinary thinking when it comes to interpreting culture. So we work with scientists, we work with clinical psychologists, we'll work with farmers, bringing all of these different stratas of society into the understanding and production.
Thank you. Very good ideas there, I think. Question from Chloe Lo. Do you think we're in a crisis of relationality following Felix Guattari, where kinship networks are reduced to bare minimum or even replaced completely? How can we share a world beyond representation? I suppose during this period of physical isolation and distancing, the digital realm has been the only way to really sustain the kind of social bonds that keep our societies together. Do you think this will change without?
It's a great question, and it's actually something that has very much shaped my work. I've written about the role of kinship, the role of friendship. I still think about it a lot. I have several texts in motion unpacking this also. When it comes to how can we share a world beyond representation, I love that question. And I think that it's incredibly important that we understand the role of images in our contemporary lives, how they're designed to control our attitudes to each other, to materiality, to consumption, to our political agency. I think much of our ability to unpack our relationship to these ideas comes from the kinship networks that we have. Kinship not being by blood, but by a likeness of ethic, of principality, of a civic duty to the people we care about. I think that the crisis of relationality, I feel it particularly for the part of the world going through the need for decolonial thinking. I think that we need to better relate our internal networks of friendship in terms of rethinking the words we use to relate to one another, understanding that those words hold forth particular histories, certain power relationships. In my experience, your kinship network is only reduced if you allow it to. In my experience, I build my network. It's a choice. You can reach out and seek another. And that another, in times of this crisis, I've reached out and what I have been given back has been phenomenal. So I think we need to lose this sense of that this isolation makes us feel we've been reduced. But we still have connectivity and we still have the agency to say, this person is interesting. I had one chat with that person that was very interesting. Nurture it, reach out, test it. It comes down to our own actions right now. And at least in my experience, it's been an empowered action to realize just how much goodwill and a sense of synergy exists out there if only you express what you're looking for. So I hope that that can challenge, all of that kind of thinking can challenge the way we operate with images and the obsession with representation.
Well, we're coming to the end of this session. Are there any final thoughts you want to share about how you see the world and our society is changing after this whole crisis? And especially the role of art within all of this as well.
I think that in light of our current, the most concerning for me right now is race and fear. The treatment of people who do not have access, and that we understand that they don't have access because of a systemic hierarchy of class. What I hope is that our cultural institutions don't continue to mimic that systemic issue.
So do you think museums to play a bigger role in this? A lot of museums in America, of course, have been called out for staying silent on this issue or not yes, not yes. Do you think
Yeah,
they should be as cultural institutions?
I think that we are in another part of the world where museums, the definitions are more fluid. China has museums that sell work, for example. The definitions of those institutions, we have the ability to think about different makeups. I'm very much aware that in the West, if you are not from a family that you can afford the entry salary to work in a museum, you're counted out. You can't work in a museum because the salaries are actually really low in comparison to the other industries. So how can we improve the experiences of those cultures and denominations that just don't have economic access, but their stories matter? You know, their stories are incredibly important. Their languages are incredibly important. And so what I'm thinking a lot about is how can we create programming and online moments and educational opportunities and facilitatory opportunities that bring those visibilities, those narratives, those spaces into our work more.
But this change in the role of museums and cultural institutions is something that's currently being debated by ICOM as well, as you may know, who's putting forward a new definition of what museums is. And it's been very controversial. The move away from its previous role of educating, collecting, preserving, and exhibiting works of art to one advocating for issues of social justice and equality. But it sounds like you agree with that. This is a role that museums should move into.
I think that we need to understand the broader landscape of social imaginations and understand that a museum sits in a very unique space today, which is very different to when museums were looming in the wake of colonial looting. We need to understand that today's museum is in the wake of political care. We have increasingly governments polarizing societies instead of uniting them. What is the role of us as cultural producers to encourage debate that says difference is necessary, that difference of opinion is necessary, and that difference should not be us against them, but recognized as an internal mechanism in each and every one of us that has doubts and fears, but also confirmations and affirmations. So I think, yes, museums do need to understand their roles must shift because our people, our communities, our cultural values, our beliefs are being challenged greatly by a political system that isn't actually there catering for what it should be doing anymore.
Well, before we go, I think we have a final question here from Selena Ting. So thanks for the very interesting conversation, Zoe. How would you evaluate your work in the Vietnamese art scene after 20 years? Say in terms of making it more visible on international platform. What has been changed and what has yet to be done?
I think that we have, I'm very happy and proud of the number of Vietnamese artists that have gone on from the local to produce and to show things abroad, still remain anchored and contributing to their local. That is heartening, and I hope that we see more of that. The international platform for Vietnamese art, I want to kind of reiterate that when I use the word international, I'm not thinking about Europe and America, but I'm thinking about the ability to show in Singapore, the ability for an artist to collaborate with another in Cambodia, to go to Thailand, and we need to better understand that is happening in our midst, not far, far away. And I think when it comes to what has been changed and what has yet to be done, what is most concerning for me is there's so much more work we need to do in Vietnam on an educational level. And that is something that I think about nearly daily in terms of the programming for the factory. We have several relationships nearly cemented and hoping that we can push from educational perspectives.
Yes, which explains all the educational collaborations that you've had and the focus on education. Well, thank you, Zoe. Thank you very much for sharing all your insights and your wisdom. Look forward to the future projects that you are going to do at the factory and I'm sure elsewhere around the world. So keep us posted. But thank you very much again for your talk today. And thank you all for joining us this morning. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.